Hey guys, this is Robbie Griggs, one of your professors for Covenant Theology, and I'm going to walk you through a paper by Francis Watson on Genesis 18 and 19 as a way of giving you some ideas for your own hermeneutical paper you're going to be writing for CovTheo. Now, a couple things to mention on the front end here is that this paper by Francis Watson is written by a professional exegete and biblical scholar, and so we're not expecting you to write anything really that approaches the quality of what he has written here, but we're expecting you to do the work of writing a hermeneutical paper and to have the experience of doing that and to gain some skills. Another thing to note is that Francis's paper here is about 6,000 words, which is 3 times longer than you'll have, and so you'll need to be much more concise, and you won't be able to go into as much length as he does here. With that being said, I think there's some things that you can learn from Francis's paper, and I'm going to walk you through those things now. The first thing to note about this paper is that it has a relatively long introduction. So this first paragraph here is an overview of the content and context of the story he's going to talk about. And Francis gives you this overview in a way to frame what comes next, which is a discussion of the two theophanies in the context that he's talking about. And one of the things to note in this paragraph is how he makes some observations that that draw your attention to features of the text that are going to be important for the thing he wants to do in the paper. So the introduction has the paper in mind, and he's doing things to set up things in the paper. So one thing he does in this next paragraph here is he draws attention to how Yahweh appears in these texts. It seems that Yahweh is presented here as one of the three men and not, for example, as speaking in and through all three of them. Now that's important because as you get further on, he's going to point out that this recognition that Yahweh is one of the three men proved fruitful for later Christian theologians and exegetes who wanted to ask Trinitarian questions of this passage. One thing Francis does after the first three paragraphs is that he calls attention to the problems that have arisen in this initial framing. Now, one thing to note here is that these are the problems that Francis wants to talk about and the ones that he's selected. He hasn't mentioned all of the problems you might mention when looking at these passages, and that's an important point for you because you're going to need to focus on the problems you want to discuss in the context of the paper. In other words, there are many things that you could do, but the question is what do you want to do in the confines of the paper? And here Francis notes 3 things that are going to be important for his paper. So in the first 3 paragraphs here, he has given us an overview of the content of this passage. And then in this 4th paragraph, he's identified the problems that relate to this content. In the 5th paragraph here, he tells us why these things are important, and he offers a couple distinctions. First, the vertical problem, and then also the horizontal problem. So he's given us the context of the passage, the problems he's identified. Now he gives us the context of Christian interpreters. So he says these problems have been of great interest to Christian interpreters who have traditionally found support here for the belief in the divine triunity. That's why Francis is talking about these things. After that, where he tells us the significance of the problem, he goes in to outline what he's going to do. Now, here's a note. Your introduction to this paper is not going to be 6 or 7 paragraphs. It's going to be 1 paragraph. And one of the things you're going to need to do is identify the main issues that you're going to be looking at, give a sense of why those are important, and then also to tell us in brief what your basic point or points are going to be from the paper. So I'm just pointing out this rather long introduction to show you that things sort of have to fit together and they have to build to the point. But the main thing for you to do is to tell us what you're going to be looking at and how the paper is going to unfold. So if we move on, what Francis is doing is he's giving us an interpretation or a reading of Justin Martyr's reading of this passage, of Augustine's reading of this passage. Then later he's going to look at John Calvin's reading of this passage, and then Herman Gunkel's reading of this passage. And then at the end, he's going to give us some brief concluding evaluations. So let's look at a couple of the things that Francis does here. Now, the thing I want you to note is that for each of the figures that Francis looks at, he's got an opening paragraph that gives you a sense of the general burden of the writer. In other words, what is Justin, in reading Genesis 18 and 19, what is he trying to do? What's the purpose of his writing? And Francis notes that the primary purpose here is that Justin is trying to argue. He's doing an apologetic exercise here, where he's trying to argue about the relationship of Christianity to the Jewish scriptures. But then he also notes a feature that's in the background here, which is Gnostic Christianity. And he makes the point that the primary task for these theologians was not to polemicize against Judaism, but on the contrary, to establish the inalienable Jewishness of Christianity, its essential rootedness in the Jewish scriptural tradition. So in Justin's dialogue with Trypho, who is a Jew, he's not trying to say that Christianity is not Jewish. He's trying to say that Christianity is in some respects the fulfillment of Judaism. So the main point, though, is that when you present a paragraph on each of your interpreters, you need to say something initially about what they're trying to do. Chrysostom is writing a homily. John Calvin is writing a commentary. Chris Wright is writing a book on mission. So those are different kinds of audiences in mind, implied audiences, and the authors are trying to do different kinds of things. And so then part of the question is, all right, what are they trying to do, and how does that relate to how they read the passage? After Francis is given this introduction, he then goes in and starts talking about what Justin actually argues. So you notice he gives a brief characterization of Justin's what Justin says. He quotes Justin, which I would encourage you to do. Take key quotes from those you're interpreting, and then he gives an overview of Justin's exegetical argument. So what Justin is doing, roots it in his text, and then gives an overview of the argument. Point 1, point 2, point 3. Okay. Here he identifies an important feature of what Justin is doing, and then he gives a conclusion about Justin's reading. So notice, the thing I want you to notice is how brief this is. Francis has got to do 4 readings of this particular passage, and he's doing it in 6,000 words. So he's got to make some decisions about what he's going to talk about, how much he's going to quote from the author, and how he's going to summarize what the author is doing. You'll need to be doing similar things. So note again, Augustine. He's got a brief introduction to what Augustine's doing. He's got key features of the text that Augustine draws attention to. And then he starts to talk down here toward the end about the relationship between Augustine and Justin on this. So how are they similar? How are they different? Notice also that what comes in here is Francis's earlier distinction between vertical and horizontal. So he's let you know that that's going to be a feature of his reading of these texts. One of the things we note as we turn to Calvin is just how Francis turns to Calvin. He says, in turning from Augustine to Calvin, we move to a different interpretive genre. So he lets us know this is a different kind of writing. Augustine's interpretive aim is to use the biblical text to establish and defend his Trinitarian doctrine, whereas Calvin writes as a commentator on Genesis, his aim being to combine responsible exegesis with edification and instruction. So Calvin is not trying to do Trinitarian theology from Genesis 18 and 19. He's trying to give commentary that edifies. So by saying that framing initially, Francis helps us know what is interesting about Calvin and Calvin's reading, or what might be potentially interesting about his reading. Notice it's always good to ask the question that the writer is asking and to show how the writer answers it. That's another thing that Francis does. He also uses more quotations from Calvin here. So he's made a decision here that with respect to Augustine, he doesn't need to do a lot of quotes, but with respect to Justin, he needs to do one big quote. But with Calvin, to really get what Calvin's doing, we need 1, 2, 3, 4 quotations, and we get much more extensive engagement with Calvin than the other two, and that's a choice that Francis makes. Note how he summarizes what Calvin is doing here. First, second, right? But there's also some recognition of the differences. Neither Calvin nor Augustine would have understood their differences in this way, which would have them derived from the scriptural word of its divine authority as radically individualizing the work of the interpreter. So he's talking about how he understands what they're doing in relation to how they would have understood what they're doing, which again, this is not just a survey of what they've done. You're interacting and interpreting and making evaluations with what they've done. Now, note here the last figure, Gunkel, is quite different from the other three. He's a later German historical critic, and so Francis is going to talk about some of the differences in terms of Gunkel's approach and what he's doing. He says Gunkel's interested in all these things, but for a quite different reason. Hermann Gunkel wishes us to understand the story as the outcome of a complex diachronic process, thereby adding an all-important and third dimension to the two-dimensional surface of the text. In other words, Gunkel's looking at how the text came to be in its final form. And part of the point that Francis is making is that you can learn some things from this. Now, moving on to the end here. Notice we've got some conclusions where Francis summarizes his findings. Now, your conclusion is going to be a little bit different from this because we're going to be asking you to compare and contrast and to make some evaluations about how your three authors read the text under consideration. All right, in conclusion, notice that the paper we're asking you to write is a 2,000-word paper, and that means you're going to have to make choices about what you cover. You're going to have to make choices about how long your introduction is going to be. I've suggested that it needs to really be just one paragraph. You're going to have to make choices about which problems you identify. So what are the things that each interpreter is interested in the text? What are the similarities and differences? You're not going to be able to map all of the similarities and differences, so you're going to need something like an identification of the problems in the passage that all of the interpreters deal with. You're going to need something like a recognition of why they're interested in these problems, how those are similar and different. Then that'll help you decide what to include and what to exclude. Then you'll need to talk a little bit about why the author is writing and how that informs how they read the text. And then you'll need to once you've done that for all three of your authors, you'll need to come to a conclusion that summarizes your findings. All right. Best wishes on this assignment. If you've got any particular questions, I would encourage you to email me. Again, I'm Robbie Griggs. You can email me through Sakai, and I would be happy to talk with you. Final word here is just to say that we don't expect you to do this perfectly. The primary point of this exercise is for you to have the experience of doing this comparison. So don't worry about getting it right. Don't worry about being perfect. Instead, ask the question, have I followed the prompts in the guidance on the paper? And what am I learning as I see how these three authors approach this biblical text in similar and different ways? God bless. Look forward to reading your papers.